Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Beth Marsh and I am the Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement with the Organization of American Historians. And it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Renee Carl is a professional genealogist and advocate for historic preservation and records access. Previously, she worked in public policy until realizing that researching dead people is easier than working with Congress. Even so, Renee is passionate about asking Congress to preserve funding for the National Archives and Records Administration because family history cannot happen without records. Renee is a member of the History, Archives, and Records Preservation Project at the OAH, the Association of Professional Genealogists Advocacy Committee, policy advisor to the recordsnotrevenue.com campaign, and founder of fundnara.com. Claire Kluskens, JD-FNGS, retired in 2025 from the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C., after nearly 33 years of service to the American people. She most recently served as a digital projects archivist and designated subject matter expert for genealogy, census-related records. She wrote and lectured frequently on federal records and NARA custody and blogs at 12key.com. Rich Venezia founded Rich Roots Genealogy in 2013. He was a member of the research team of Genealogy Roadshow on PBS for 2 seasons and is an expert in the research of 20th century immigrant ancestors, especially underutilized record sources and federal records. He works with law firms and individuals on complex U.S. derivative citizenship cases and also specializes in Italian and Irish research. Additionally, he assists clients with dual citizenship applications and is a proud Italian dual citizen. He lectures nationwide and spoke at TEDx Pittsburgh 2017. He is an award-winning records access advocate. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
We're honored to be here today, Beth. Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Renee Carl. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. And before we get to talk about funding America, well, we're here today for Fund America's Stories, Advocacy, and the National Archives. But before we talk about the impact of funding cuts on the National Archives operations and steps for advocacy to support NARA, I want to discuss how records get to the National Archives in the first place. Let's step back in time and leave this lovely, dreamy full card of records and think about what was happening a couple hundred years ago in DC.
Hey, Renee.
It's not advancing.
No, you are sharing presenter mode now. I don't know what changed.
Okay. So do you see the screen with the illustration of a fire right now?
Yes, but we see presenter mode.
Ah, okay. Sorry about that. How about now?
Still see presenter mode.
Okay. Okay. And now?
Yep, good to go.
Well, folks, I am proving my point here entirely that I should be left with textual records in the archives and not doing technology. All right, so a couple hundred years ago, when the US, the baby US government was trying to figure out how to govern itself, trying to figure out what city they were going to govern in and build that city at the same time, they weren't really thinking about where they were going to store records. And sometimes when they were thinking about storing records, they weren't thinking about it so logically. So in the early 1800s, the records of the Patent Office were in the Blodgett Hotel. That wood structure went up in flames in 1836. They realized that this was a huge loss of records, and they set forth plans for an indestructible building. They finished that building in 1864 and filled it with wooden and glass cabinet cases. You can see those cases tucked in behind the columns in this photo. So while the exterior of this building was indestructible, it actually stands today as the National Portrait Gallery, the interior also went up in flames in 1877. And it was fire again in 1921 in the Commerce Department destroying almost all of the 1890 census and many, many other records. It was this, not final fire, but this fire in particular that galvanized not only Congress, not only the executive branch, but the public also to advocate for records preservation, to conceptualize and to fund the building of a national archives. So yeah, the building of the National Archives and this image being topped out in 1934 reminds us that America's mission to preserve its records is a fairly new effort. The National Archives is a senior citizen. It's not something that began 250 years ago. All those records did not immediately transfer. It took a program of the Works Progress Administration to look in nooks and crannies for the scattered mess of federal records, evidenced by this 1935 photo of chaotic storage of War Department records in the White House garage. The imposing edifice set on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol building was never going to hold everything. Agencies regularly complained about where they were going to store the reams and reams of paper, of records they commented were important and they needed them at least for a while, but it was not going to be a forever situation. And it took until after World War II, in 1950, for the government to pass the Federal Records Act, creating a procedure of federal records management with three main components: having an executive branch departments and agencies to collect, retain, and preserve, or sometimes have permission to dispose of their federal records; to create a coordinated system to exist between the National Archives, these departments and agencies on determining document retention; and to create a set of federal record centers, storage facilities that were operated by the National Archives, but the agencies paid rent to store their extra documents in them. This is an early one shown here in Brooklyn. It had previously served as a Navy clothing depot warehouse during World War II. It then, in the 1950s, housed a lot of Immigration and Naturalization Service records, along with other records. Now, records in the custody of the National Archives, let me back up. Federal record centers store records that are still in their first life. They are records that exist and are still needed for agency use, or the agency thinks they're going to need to check them again 5, 10, 20 years later. And then they have a purpose. It's their first life. Records in the custody of the National Archives have transferred. They are records in their second life, and they are being accessed for historical reasons, for other reasons too, but they are no longer being used regularly by an agency. Now, to make your note-taking easier, all of this information about the Federal Records Act, along with a lot more details about the Federal Records Act, links to the legislation, can all be found at fundnara.com. That's FUNDNARA.com. Federal Record Centers facilities today are state-of-the-art. They are secure, they have cold storage. This is an image of a facility in Lenexa, Kansas, but I'm not here to talk about the buildings. I want to go back to the Federal Records Act and to government record keeping, and why this process of government record keeping is essential to democracy. There are a lot of reasons that agencies need to keep records. They are recording documents of people, places, and things that matter to agency business, including how an agency operates and the role and actions of its officials. It's recording, it's taking records to provide Congress or other agencies the ability to scrutinize government functions. The records are also available to the public through the Freedom of Information Act and the requests you can make through FOIA. Of course, this is a topic recently covered in an OAH webinar. FOIA allows those outside of government to request records, and they also can scrutinize federal government functions. And this is a level of transparency that is essential to democratic operation. Records exist to protect financial, legal, and other rights of the government and/or people impacted or affected by agency actions. And records document policy creation and decisions. Now, as much as we as researchers and historians want every record saved and every piece of paper available at the National Archives, the Federal Records Act had to be a little more reasonable. They had to provide a process for records to be designated as temporary and placed in storage until an agreed upon date for destruction. Or they had to designate the records as permanent and put them in storage until a certain date upon which legal custody would transfer these records to the National Archives for use. This process is coordinated by an agency-based records officer, National Archives staff, and ultimately the decision is signed off by the Archivist of the United States. This is statutory. This is statute. This is not something that like moves and changes with the wind. This is the way the legislation has been crafted. Throughout the process, as the records officer and National Archives representatives determine the historical value of records, they're thinking about this temporary or permanent designation, but of course, their definition of important historical record is fixed within the time frame of their decision. What I wish existed today for my research today was deemed temporary more than 50 years ago. Now, of course, there's lots of records I can still research, but there are a few things I just really like. I have this angst, I just wish they still existed. Both temporary and permanent records can be housed at the agencies. They can be housed within a federal records center where the agency pays rent to the National Archives, or upon transferring legal custody, they are stored at the National Archives, one of the archive's regional facilities, or sometimes stay within the FRC, but then NARA is no longer receiving rent for those records. Now, when there's a government, there are forms, right? And this is a standard form 115. This is tracking the disposition of records, whether they are to remain whether they are temporary or whether they are to become permanent. Make it a little bit bigger so you can see it better. And this is a request for authority to dispose of records. So these records are not going to be retained. The foreign address and occupation index cards, part of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, were determined to not be important. And they had a very obtuse way of saying when that 20 years would come about for the agency to destroy them. If they were or not destroyed is a story for another presentation. Record schedules also instruct a timeline on which records should change custody from the agency to the National Archives. Both temporary and permanent records are still accessible to the agency, and as I said before, they are also accessible to the public via FOIA. And while it is difficult to change a temporary designation to permanent, it can be done through advocacy. Permanent records can languish in agency custody long beyond the time they were to transfer to the National Archives. There are various reasons, from insufficient indexing or lack of finding aids to simply being forgotten. So sometimes permanent records need advocacy too. The alien registration forms, an example seen on the screen here, also known as AR2s, were created for use between 1940 and 1944. They became part of NARA's permanent collection in May of 2024, in large part due to an advocacy campaign created by our friend here, Rich. It was known as Records Not Revenue, and the process started in 2019. Sometimes advocacy takes more than a minute to get a result. The AR2s were once paper records. They were microfilmed in the 1950s, and they were later digitized. So they transferred to the National Archives as digital records. These digital records are serviced by the Center for Electronic Records. Since they became available, the CER staff have reported a more than 200% increase in reference inquiries, and they've had an astounding 11,000% increase in requests for record copies. Obviously, the public wanted easy access to these records. They're wildly popular. And there are many, many other record sets that the public wants easy access to. But that is impossible with current staffing and funding levels at the National Archives. We have to ask the question of ourselves, how can we expect NARA to possibly keep up? Before I turn the mic over to my colleagues, let me sum up. I've briefly explained how the National Archives came to be with efforts to gather federal records from agencies into a central location. I talked about how the post-World War II government realized there needed to be another layer of organization and created both and with the Federal Records Act also created storage facilities called Federal Records Centers, and how the Federal Records Act functions to get us access to records or not, and allow us to research, analyze, and tell the story of our American history. I'm now going to turn things over to Claire, who will provide us with a unique perspective on the impacts of funding cuts to the functionality of the National Archives.
So thank you, Renee, and thank you everyone who's at the webinar today. And as Beth mentioned at the beginning, I retired from NARA after nearly 33 years of service. So I come at this with the perspective of someone who's been on the inside. And I had the privilege of sitting at a desk essentially surrounded by thousands of cubic feet of permanently valuable federal records that are underutilized and that have the potential to unlock so many new and interesting stories about American and world history and of individual people, common people, normal people, as well as the famous people, by the stories told by those records. And so I'm going to take you inside a little bit to show you sort of from the inside what it looks like. So on the screen, we have from Record Group 92, the records of the Office of the Quartermaster General, a small bundle of records from the record series of reports of clerks, wagon masters, and printers employed at various posts right at the end of the Civil War period. A lot of records that the federal government created during the 19th century were trifolded. Trifolding is what happens when you take a piece of paper and fold it in two places in order to put it in an envelope. It's the same kind of thing. And so that was the way the government stored its records. So to use these records, to make them accessible, they need to be flattened and placed in file folders and described and arranged and ultimately digitized. So we'll go to the next. So this gives you an idea of what the records look like. Now that box there, that brown box, I will tell you, I think it was about 70 years old. It was not acid-free, it was not low lignin, but I can tell you that these records now live in appropriate archival boxes that are acid-free and low lignin, in folders that are acid-free and low lignin. But until recently, that's what these records were housed in. So we'll go to the next slide.
Sorry, Claire, I'm trying to get it to advance. Rich, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, Renee is working on the slides. That's fine. We'll talk about, like I said, I had the privilege of working among the records. And so when I tell you that budget cuts hurt, that they have an effect, that having a shoestring budget for an agency over decades, that has a real effect. And that's why records sat in 70-year-old boxes for decades, because NARA never has had enough resources, enough staff, enough boxes, enough time to process the records that it has. And the amount of records that comes in only increases, not only paper records, but also electronic records in the modern era. And okay, so we'll go to this. This is another example of records from the National Archives. We see an example of how the staff of decades ago did not have the resources they needed to really do the job correctly. This is a box that had from Record Group 393, the records of U.S. Army Continental Commands. And at the far left, about 1.5 inches, the records that are sort of flopped over and so forth. Those are cargo manifests, as indicated on the left side of the screen. Those records are trifolded, and they're too tall for this box. But my predecessors decades ago did the best they could. And so the best they could was to put them in a box to which they were not suited. Then the next segment of records that's wrapped in a white string, and then the tail of the string sort of flies off to the right. But the part that's wrapped in the white string, again, that's a second record series that are trifolded records. Those are the papers relating to levees. And then finally, the part of the boxes I was interested in that I wanted to digitize was that the half of the box starting in the middle there and going towards the right-hand side of the image. Those are the census returns for the parish of Plaquemine and Iberville in 1864 in Louisiana. And to get that from that box into the National Archives catalog, obviously they had to come out of this box. And then we'll go to the next slide. They needed to be flattened, and so here they are. Still not exactly flat, but next slide. And finally, the ultimate destination is a brand new archival box with brand new archival folders. They're flattened, they're arranged, and from this point, then they were able to be digitized. But it's a lot of physical labor. This isn't something that AI can do. You know, computers will never solve all their problems. This is a physical task that people actually have to do, and then they can be digitized. So that's an example. These are just examples of thousands of cubic feet of records in the National Archives that are trifolded from the 19th century, that are not well described in the National Archives catalog, catalog.archives.gov, that contain many, many stories, much information about the American people and our history, but that are virtually inaccessible for the various reasons that I've mentioned: the poor description, the lack of access, the lack of knowledge of historians and others about these records. So I want to go back in time for a moment and talk about how budget cuts affect the National Archives' ability to do things. So I want to go back in history to the early 1980s when the Reagan administration wanted to cut the size of the US government. The National Archives suffered about a 17% cut. I was told by the old timers that people in those days wore a lapel button that said, "Give it your best with 17% less." Well, you can't do more with less. You can't even do the same with less. You can only do less with less. And so what happened? There was work that was deferred, delayed, and sometimes never done at all because they lost the people, they lost the money to do things. So examples of that: declassification of State Department records from the early 1950s got delayed. Document preservation work, of which there is an unending amount, was slowed down. The National Archives microfilm publications program, we're not quite ready for that slide there, Renee, collapsed. You might say, well, who cares about microfilm? That's so 20th century. Well, microfilm was the internet of its day. Scholars and other researchers could go to a nearby research library that had the microfilm they needed instead of going to Washington, D.C. And the microfilm that was created has an effect today. The microfilm publications of the National Archives were the first federal records to go online because anybody pretty much can digitize a roll of microfilm. And so Ancestry.com, Heritage Quest, Family Search, the first federal records that went online were microfilm federal records. So the investment that the National Archives made in the 1970s is still paying dividends today. But in the early 1980s, the microfilm publications program collapsed and it went down to a trickle. And so the investment that we had made didn't continue like it should have. And there were actually about a couple of dozen microfilm projects that were planned that just never happened because of the budget cuts. And so that's the effect that budget cuts can have, that the access that microfilm would have provided didn't happen then, and it still hasn't happened because those records weren't ever microfilmed and they're not online in any format. Okay, so let's go on to the slide that you just showed us, the fire slide. So to give you an idea of work that gets delayed and just takes forever to get done because of lack of resources, we can give you the example of the 1973 NPRC fire, the National Personnel Record Center fire, in which a 6-story building became a 5-story building, and millions of records of military service in World War II and World War I were destroyed, and millions more records were damaged. And here's an example of a record that has had conservation treatment so that an image, a copy, could be provided to a researcher. But to use the words of the conservation staff at the NPRC in St. Louis, they are, quote, still doing triage 50 years after that fire. Can you imagine that? There's still so much work to do to preserve records that exist but are damaged like this one. So that's just kind of sobering to think that so much work remains, but that is the reality of not ever having enough resources over decade after decade. And so really, in my view, as someone who's been inside, the National Archives cannot afford budget cuts and needs to keep a robust level of funding. And all of us need to ask Congress for their help. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Rich.
All right, thanks, Claire. Let me share here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about funding, appropriations, budget, continuing resolutions, etc. So, as we all likely know, the National Archives, along with other governmental agencies, have been funded by continuing resolution for the entirety of fiscal year 2025 based on the previous fiscal year. Remember, of course, that the US government's fiscal year is the 1st of October to the 30th of September. Since Congress didn't finish its fiscal year 2025 appropriations work, they kept the level at the previous year. Now, Congress appropriated a little over $450 million to the National Archives in the continuing resolution that passed back in March. 23 million of that was actually designated for the presidential transition, and that's something normal that happens every 4 or 8 years between administrations. So you'll look at and see at it seems like it might be slightly inflated, but that's the specific reason. That money is specifically going to the presidential transition and the presidential library. As of the shutdown, NARA has actually only received $402.22 million. So it's actually $48 million less than what Congress said that they would get when the continuing resolution passed back in March. Now, of course, just to clarify, that's what the usaspending.gov website says. It's possible it wasn't fully up to date as of midnight on the day that the government shut down last week. We can only report to you what is publicly available. Now, moving forward for 2026, as we know, the government is shut down. Congress has not finished its work on passing appropriations bills for fiscal year 2026. A lot of the bills are drafts and have only gone through parts of committees. So there was a stopgap continuing resolution bill passed out of the House, but not by the Senate. A continuing resolution provides temporary funding at the prior fiscal year's level and keeps the government running until Congress completes that work. The White House budget proposal for the National Archives for fiscal year 2026 was at $404.25 million. Actually, the House Appropriations, Financial Services, and General Government subcommittees knocked over $4 million of that off that number and was passed out of their committee at a funding level of only $400 million. So that's where things stand as of now. Of course, many things may change in the coming weeks. But to give you an idea of the flat funding that the National Archives has suffered over the past several decades, we see here the red dotted line is the average, the 19-year average from 2007 to 2025, at an average of almost $366 million per year. We see here, this is 2025 and 2026. We noted some of these numbers in the previous slide about how, this number may look like slightly more because of the presidential transition. And then, of course, the proposal versus the House committee, we'll see what winds up happening with those numbers. But something that's important to note, that out of that 400 million, which maybe seems like a lot of money, we'll see in a moment how it's actually really not when it comes to much government spending. NARA's operating expenses include legislative, presidential, and museum services, citizen services, agency services, facility operations, and their electronic records initiative. NARA's budget is complicated. There's lots of different parts. We're focusing specifically on NARA's operational expenses when we talk about the money that NARA is appropriated. So the operational expenses cover everything from keeping the lights on to keeping the records properly climate controlled, working with agencies who are providing their records to the National Archives to make sure those records officers are maintaining and transferring their records as they are meant to, paying the salaries of the staff who pull the records, staff the research room, assist patrons with requests, provide limited remote research assistance, and also do some digitization of records. The National Archives is doing behemoth work with what they are able to in terms of digitization efforts. They're currently at a little over 3.5% of their holdings. Operating expenses also includes, I'm sorry, I don't know why my slides keep automatically advancing. I apologize. Those operating expenses also include improving their technological capabilities, maintaining that website and their online catalog, intaking enormous amounts of electronic data, more data than we could ever even imagine exists, and maintaining those servers to store that immense amount of electronic data. So when we look at where the National Archives facilities are located, we're talking about nearly 3,000 employees across 16 states and the District of Columbia. So in this map, we see the blue dots are those federal record centers. The green ones are National Archives research facilities. We have New York City National Archives, which closed in recent years, and presidential museums across different states as well. Now, when we talk about NARA's budget, which is currently sitting at hopefully around $400 million for next year, when we look at what that means in relation to what Americans spend on other things or what other agencies are appropriated, we see a stark contrast. Americans actually spend $300 million on coffee every day. That's only $100 million less than the National Archives is set to receive next year. There was a Da Vinci painting that sold in 2017 for $450 million, more money than the National Archives has ever seen. The US Census Bureau, for instance, receives over 3 times what the Archives has received. NARA's budget is less than 0.01% of the entire federal budget. That's essentially a rounding error when it comes to the federal budget. We know that lots of other agencies get a lot of other appropriations, and hopefully we've been able to explain to you the enormous work that the National Archives does on their shoestring budget. And so the National Archives is set to receive a funding cut next year under their current proposals. So we want you, we hope that you will want to advocate for the records and for the National Archives. If researchers and historians and genealogists care about access to and preservation of these records, we must be vocal about it. We have to advocate for no cuts to the National Archives budget And importantly, tell the offices of your elected officials why the National Archives is important to you, how it helps your research, how it helps your job. Give them information about why they should care about the National Archives. We know firsthand that these offices very rarely hear about the National Archives. And so even a handful of people calling the same senator or the same congressperson's office really does make a difference, because this is not something that their offices are frequently hearing about. Also, if your senator or representative is on an oversight committee, which would be the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee on the Senate, or the U.S. Committee on Oversight and Government Reform in the House, they are especially folks that should be contacted about the National Archives, as those committees have direct oversight of the National Archives. But it's important to remember that anyone can be an advocate, and you can advocate to anyone. You can certainly reach out to the office of the chair of HISCAC, even if that person is not your senator, for instance. So let's take a look at how easy it can be to contact the offices of your elected officials. All right. So if you go to congress.gov/members, this is the easiest way for you to find access to your senators and representative, as well as their contact information. So if we look up, for instance, 2315 Jane Street in Pittsburgh, you'll see it auto-populates addresses. We click on that one, and it tells us straight away who our 3 elected representatives are: Senator John Fetterman, Representative Summer Lee, Senator David McCormick. And so they actually generally make it quite easy for you to fill out an online contact form. If we go to Senator Fetterman's contact form, for instance, it actually gets us right to his contact page. We can share our thoughts. We can tell his office what we think about the National Archives, why we believe it's important to keep them funded. Also, of course, you'll find their DC office numbers, and on their websites, you can find their regional office numbers if you would like to give the office a call. Each contact form is going to look a little different. Congresswoman Summer Lee's website has a contact us page. If you want to send them an email, they have a specific form that they want you to fill out. You've got to look up your address. The reason they do a lot of this is to ascertain that, A, people are not bots, and also the people that are contacting these representatives are indeed within their district. So in this case, we'd fill out the address, and we would then be able to go on to the next step to fill out the contact form. It's not always as easy, but well, they don't always take you straight to the contact us page, but it's still pretty easy to get to that. In the case of Senator David McCormick, when we get to his home page, we click on Contact Dave, and then we've got to figure out which of these we want to fill out. In this case, we want to share our opinion. And it's a similar form to the other ones that we have seen. It's that easy to reach out to your elected officials, especially if you maybe don't feel like you have enough information to talk about on the phone. By all means, write some information out through their email forms. You can write or call as many times as you'd like about all sorts of different issues, but we're hoping that you spend some time advocating for specifically the archives. And another way that I wanted to just briefly note before we wrap up and take some questions is another way that you are able to advocate is through your research. Continue to share. Yes, yes, maybe. Yes, okay, sorry, I want to make sure I was sharing the same thing. All right, so Renee had talked earlier about the records that are in federal records facilities, how you can submit Freedom of Information Act requests as a member of the public in order to obtain access to certain records. If your research involves records held in a federal records center, records of an agency that are not in the custody of the National Archives, but that are held in a federal records center, do you know what their disposition is? Do you know if they're scheduled as temporary or permanent? One of the most important things you can do is learn that information, which you can learn often via a Freedom of Information Act request for the record schedules. Sometimes those record schedules are also available online. But additionally, when you make FOIA requests to agencies for specific records, those records are not able to be destroyed until those requests have been fulfilled. By sending requests for records that are relevant to your research, you can raise these records out of anonymity and perhaps put them back on the radar of the agency. Another project that myself and a few fellow advocates worked on in the past few years were the petition files, now held by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, that were created in the early to mid-1900s from the Bureau of Naturalization and then the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS. These are individual files of naturalization examiners for nearly all the individuals who petitioned for naturalization from 1906 to 1950. So we're talking about 10 to 12 million records, almost 22,000 cubic feet of surviving material that was hidden away for several decades. Now these records you can request through a Freedom of Information Act request to USCIS, but they often take several years. However, due perhaps to our hundreds of FOIA requests that were sent for these records over the past several years, the records became known again to individuals at the agency who'd never heard of them before, who didn't know they had these records, who didn't know they were paying to store these records. And though we don't know this with 100% certainty, I think we can safely say that our advocacy efforts for those records are the reason that they were recently rescheduled as permanent records. And their home, once certain preparation work is done, will be the National Archives. That work, that success happened because of a merry band of volunteers making FOIA requests and being a little bit of a thorn in the side of the agency to make them understand how important these records are. So there are many ways that you can advocate, perhaps even ways that you may not have thought of or that you're already doing, but hadn't considered it to be advocacy. So I want to throw it back to Renee briefly before we take some questions.
Thank you, Rich. Rich, can you queue up the Talking Points website to share after I say this little bit here?
Yes.
Thank you. So I want to leave everybody with a few thoughts before we go to question and discussion. This year, 2025, since February through the 30th of September, that's just over 7 months, NARA's workforce has shrunk by 14%. That's due to a combination of reduction in force, deferred retirements, departures for various reasons, or people choosing to retire because they thought, well, maybe if I leave, then someone else will not be RIF'd. That's not only a brain drain, those are positions that are not scheduled to be backfilled. The current proposed funding cuts are at more than 10% of NARA's budget. With support for electronic records, the largest growing population of records there could possibly be, that is proposed to be cut by more than 1/3. Congress and the White House are making decisions today that are going to impact US record keeping for decades to come. When we think about this, we need to ask questions like, what's going to happen to the research rooms and the regional facilities? What's going to happen at the federal record centers where the documents are stored? Are there going to be sufficient facilities and operational staff to monitor the security and their preservation? What about the NPRC, the currently operating one, not the one Claire mentioned with the fire? They house both civilian and military records that are still used daily. Are those facilities going to have adequate staffing to preserve and protect these service records? Will there be adequate staffing to monitor the servers for the NARA online catalog, the hundreds of informative pages, not to mention the servers for the electronic records? What about the electronic records with this massive budget cut? What about processing of FOIA records or classified records already decades behind? And what is happening to the records of today with all these staffing losses and all the agencies shedding employees or being closed? What is happening to those records? Are there any records officers left? Are they able to find their counterpart at the National Archives to facilitate the retention of the records as the lights are being shut off in their agencies? Or is there even a concept of temporary or permanent in this current environment? The lack of access to records endangers the United States civic memory, but isn't it more dire than that? Government transparency depends on the National Archives, which makes the National Archives the bedrock of our democracy. How can we not speak out? So with those words, I'm going to ask Rich to show you one more thing that can help you with your advocacy efforts. You got that ready?
Yes.
Thank you.
This is what you were talking about, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
You could go ahead.
I was going to say, so on our website, funnara.com, we have some comment starters that are just some ways to get you thinking about what you might want to say in your advocacy, letters, emails, calls, etc. It's really important that you personalize your letter. It doesn't need to be 12 paragraphs or 20 pages long. But the most effective advocacy campaigns are ones that include personalized messages. So on our website, funnara.com, you can go to comment starters, and this will give you some ideas on how to get started with your comments.
Thank you. And thank you all for putting up with my complete meltdown at the beginning with my sharing of the slides. And hopefully we have some questions that we can address and take some comments or thoughts about how things can be done.
Thank you guys so much. So we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, how much can politics impact what is saved? And are there guardrails that make that less of a issue?
Something that I know, not only did Claire have the opportunity to work at NARA every day, but Rich and I have the privilege of researching, well, when there's not a shutdown, we both have the opportunity and privilege to research at the National Archives regularly. And we know a lot of NARA staff because we rely on them for information, for help on discerning vague finding aids, finding records that long lost agencies created. And something we know is NARA staff are passionately non-political. They service the records, and they service the records of the federal government, regardless of who came in or what was due, like any administration, they're not making choices. They're following the rules and procedures on federal records established in the Federal Records Act and determining how and when it can be shared. There are privacy regulations, there are other national security regulations, but all of that is laid out. So there are guardrails with the current staff and the training that they have, but they're losing staff, and we just don't have the transparency and the insight that we once had. But advocacy is part of that. You're talking about a record set that maybe you're worried about, making sure that it is not, you're not the only person who knows about it. There's a set of records that a historian reached out to both me and Rich about. And this person pointed out that the records are scheduled as temporary, and there's no interest right now in changing these records from temporary to permanent. They're actually due for destruction very, very soon. So we've started an effort to FOIA every to documents out of every box to try and save these records. So there's, I guess I'm saying there's different ways to create guardrails. But we don't, right now they're servicing everything, and the staff are not going to make decisions about what they are servicing and not servicing. I see the comment. I can't tell you. I don't have permission to share what this particular set of records are that we've been working on. But Claire or Rich, I welcome you to offer additional comments.
I think Rich was going to say something.
No, I wasn't. I was going to say there's a couple of other questions, so we might want to move on to those.
Yeah, I mean there are laws and procedures for the destruction of records that are temporary, and there are laws and procedures, and we have to hope that the laws and procedures will be followed, and NARA staff will do their best to do that. That I have faith in.
Another question that's actually two questions in one. Is there any coordinated effort among various groups for protecting history funding and interpretation? NEH, NARA, IMLS, MPS, Smithsonian. I know that these are different line items in the budget, but many groups are chipping away at the same overall underfunding. I think that was only one question.
Okay. So at one point in time, there was an organization trying to collectively do work on history writ large, anything that was about history. So that included the National NHPRC, Historical Publications
And Records Commission.
Thank you. Which has been zeroed out. There's been, I think, efforts for different groups to align their advocacy days so that they would be, 1 week would be Library Week, 1 week would be Humanities Week, 1 week would be a different week. So there would be a continuing drumbeat and overlapping messaging. I don't, to be honest, to be quite honest, I can't say how successful that has been in terms of including the National Archives specifically. And that's why in January, I felt it was important to create a website, and that is fundnara.com, to create this website that was focused specifically on the National Archives. And that effort grew out of the work Rich was leading on Records Not Revenue, where we realized we can keep yelling and yelling about record schedules not being followed and about records not transferring to the National Archives. But as we see with the AR2s and the explosive growth in requests, that's not tenable. That's not possible for NARA to ingest the records if they don't have the funding to operate. So that became the important focus. As a DC resident, I also say folks here are beleaguered, and we would love to see support coming from across the country. And as I saw in the comments, you don't have to come to DC. It's expensive. It's super expensive here. You don't have to come here. There are offices of your representatives and senators across your states. They will respond if you send personal messages, and you might need to follow up more than once. But it's the personal message that rings through. It's why we don't support an auto-populated message being sent out of the website.
Yeah.
And phone calls, I've heard are said to be especially effective. And I know that the idea of calling your senator can sound extremely scary, but a lot of at least a couple of senators and maybe all of them have basically a voicemail where you can leave your voicemail message, so you don't actually have to be scared about talking to an actual person. So there are many things you can do. You could call the local office, write to the local office, whatever you feel comfortable with. But doing something is really important. That's the most important thing, is to do something.
And Renee, you kind of touched on part of this question, but it is which parts of NARA's operations will be most impacted by the planned funding cuts? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, at least as it's sketched out, the part that will take the greatest hit for reasons we cannot figure out are electronic records, with a proposed 1/3 of their budget being eliminated. I can't explain it. I don't know how. It's even with AI, that doesn't make any sense at all, because electronic records started at the National Archives in the 70s, right? How many of you can open WordPerfect now or open a 5 1/4 floppy disk? There's probably people on here who have no idea what those words mean. So those are all things that electronic records preservationists know how to work with them. They know how to access them. There are ancient databases that need to be updated. There's electronic records on tape. The electronic records are not just the stuff that comes off the internet. So that seems to be the thing that will take the greatest hit, along with the digitization efforts.
Yeah,
Claire, you might
digitization.
know.
Well, I don't know that I know, since I'm not there, but I mean, it's across the board. I mean, yes, Renee is right, absolutely right. In terms of dollar amount, the electronic records, which are only growing, is taking a huge hit. But the loss at the National Archives is across the board. It is everything. You know, from the 19th century records that are still not going to be rehoused and made available, unless you come and see them. You know, same thing. There'll be no change. So it's across the board, totally across the board. Every last thing.
So I think I saw one other question that was about FOIA. I will have an opportunity to make a plug for OAH's work, because Beth, I think it was a couple weeks ago, there was a how to do FOIA for historians. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that recently went online as recording.
That is correct. It is now on our YouTube channel. And so you can find tons of great information there. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for being here today and walking us through all this and answering questions. We very much appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.